Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. I've got with me my good friend David Erasmus, and we're going to be talking about a sermon that David preached a couple of days ago at Trinity-at-Waiake. But before we get onto that, I'd just like to give a little bit of promotional material about Live on Air broadcasts. Every Sunday we obviously have at our church services a great variety of sermons and theological input, and so it's helpful sometimes to gather these together and repackage them for live streaming in Facebook and live streaming in YouTube and so on. And what we hope to do with this is to encourage people to enter into theological dialogue. And it's with that in mind that I was really interested in David's sermon last Sunday, which was on some topics that are particularly relevant in this vast age of materialism with which Western society is constantly having to live with, and particularly Christianity is having to deal with because it's such a different kind of philosophy. Now, there are different aspects to those philosophies of materialism. We're going to be looking at one in particular tonight and a couple of counters to it. So let's say, David, would you like to give us the background to the kind of sermon that you were preaching on Sunday? Thanks.
Well, I think the point that is perhaps most relevant here is that I was talking about a story I read about a vicar in South London who was describing how diverse his congregation it was, and how similar to each other another group was that he'd visited. And this group was a group of what are known as effective altruists. Now, this is a movement which started about 2010 in Oxford, and it's a group of people, mostly young people, generally in their 20s, who've made money, let's say, very quickly and easily through perhaps Bitcoin or app development, or maybe through social media, and feel they'd like to give something back, and have sort of embarked on a process where they donate some money and then try to do the best they can with that money. So the idea behind this is it gets a little bit competitive, and this is what he found particularly compelling, was that they'd sort of compete with each other about who can do the most good with the least amount of money. Now, altruism itself is, a topic about how one actually goes out and does things which doesn't directly impact on you. It's selfless. But the idea that they have is they'd like to go out and do good in the world, and the vicar was particularly drawn to them. He wasn't expecting to be. He went there thinking quite negative thoughts about them, but actually enjoyed them because they were genuinely trying to do some good. What he felt was, and I think I feel the same, is that what they were doing was they were focusing on numbers. They were trying to see who could do the most good, who could affect the most number of people. And this, of course, stems from the fact that many of them come from a programming, statistical, scientific background. So seeing who could help the largest number of people with the smallest amount of money. And in a sense, that's what is often referred to as utilitarianism. And although utilitarianism has its values, it does have its weaknesses as well. It's quite useful for some things. For example, if you're just having a political discussion and you're trying to decide whether a particular policy is good or bad, you can see whether that policy helps a lot of people or not. However, if you're looking at something which may harm people, then you've got to take that into account as well. And for this, utilitarianism is not as good. It doesn't seem to be particularly good for making ethical choices. No.
So would you say, David, that utilitarianism is really summed up by this phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number? Or I mean, I know there are different aspects to it. But
yeah, there's a lot of flavors of utilitarianism, but that's probably one of the simplest starts to it. Some flavors try to bring into it the concept that you must at the same time not harm people. But yes, that's the simplest way of putting it, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. A simple example which I used was to try and show why it's not as good with ethical choices. Let's say you've got a train barreling out of control down a track, and in front of you are the points, and the train is going to kill 2 people, let's say, tied to those tracks. You have the option where you can just manage to turn the points so it goes down a different route and kills 1 person instead. The idea is in utilitarianism that if you end up killing 1 person instead of 2, that would be then a positive outcome, and if you should do it. So that's the utilitarianism answer, is killing 1 person is less bad than killing 2. Now, from a pure ethical point of view, I would say that's the wrong answer. And one way of seeing it's the wrong answer, if you were to take the 1 person and replace it with a child, then there was very few people, I think, will decide to kill a child instead of 2 people. I think in this particular example, I realize it's just a thought experiment. Utilitarianism seems to give the wrong answer.
Nevertheless, it's quite a fascinating example, because it's trying to relate things to practical instances, and sometimes culture also plays a part here, because some cultures you would find that it wouldn't be women and children first, it would be adult males first.
Indeed.
So the utilitarian argument does rely on some kinds of cultural presuppositions that often aren't explored, I suspect.
And also things change historically over time. There may have been a time where you had 1 or 2 deaths in the building of a bridge would be considered acceptable. Today, hopefully, we'd say it would not be acceptable. Yeah.
Okay. We don't want to try and create the impression that utilitarianism is just summed up by that one phrase, but no. That's the phrase that's commonly used, isn't
indeed,
it?
Yes. And it's the largest part of it, indeed, yes.
Right. How do you contrast utilitarianism with that group that you were talking about, that the vicar had drawn attention to, the sort of disinterested altruists who wanted to make a difference, but they're still, in some ways, they're still using a bit of a utilitarian argument, aren't they?
Absolutely, they are. They are focusing solely on the number of people, and you can understand why they might want to do that, because that is a clear mathematical result. But you can actually see immediately why that might be less good, because sometimes helping 1 person can be just as good as helping 10 people. Again, if you take the example of a train track and now apply it the other way around. So, because the trouble with utilitarianism generally as a philosophy is that it's concerned for people in general rather than people in particular. Let's say you live on the street and there's a blind woman on the street, and you donate money for a seeing eye dog. You're helping somebody you know. Now, someone will say to you that helping 1,000 people survive a tropical disease far away is more valuable, because 1,000 is better than 1. But the woman lives just down your street. So that is, in a sense, where I think Christianity is something totally different. Not that we are not supposed to help people all over the world, but it's a key thing is you're supposed to help your neighbor. You're supposed to be referencing the people immediately around you, and you're supposed to be focused on those things. An example for utilitarianism, which is often quoted in the Bible, and of course it rather knocks it on the head immediately, is Judas was seen as a prime example of a utilitarianism. Because, for example, when in John chapter 12, when Mary anoints Jesus' feet with an expensive ointment, Judas said, well, we could have sold that ointment and had a lot of money, and we could have helped the poor, which after all is what we're supposed to be doing. And Jesus rebuked him and said, well, you'll always have poor people. I won't always be with you. So the simple answer is not always the correct answer. If I take a wild example from today's news, where Elon Musk shot off a space car into electric car into space, there's a lot of criticism you could make on the ethics of doing something like that. But one of the things I read today was that somebody said, well, let's first solve all the violence and all the hunger and everything on earth before we do something like that out into space. And the truth is, if you do that, you're never actually going to imagine and do anything more than what you see around you. And I think one of the things I feel about Christianity is that it draws us to try to be the best people we can for the people around us. And I think that's what the gospel is. It's this idea that, and the reason why it appeals to so many different people in different backgrounds is it's not just a philosophy of life. It's not just a set of rules about what you do in every given situation. It's a relationship with God. And that, in a sense, is very adaptable. It means you can, unlike utilitarianism, which ends up with being quite rigid and you end up with a narrow set of rules, having this relationship with God enables you to be more adaptable to situations. The phrase I used in the sermon, which is how I see it, and I can happily see people might disagree with me, is I don't think Jesus cares about people in general. I think he cares about you. And I think that sums up Christianity as opposed to utilitarianism.
Yeah, I find that a very striking way of putting it, David, because utilitarianism and the other philosophies of materialism, and I think though the people that put the philosophical arguments together for utilitarianism were hoping to create good moral choices, I feel that they fell into a simple trap of numerical values. And you've been able to use a most striking phrase, either God cares for you or Jesus cares for you, or I suppose the Spirit cares for you. And it's not anything other than you. It is you as an individual.
Indeed.
And you couldn't find a better contrast than the contrast that you made in that sermon. I don't imagine that this is, definitive answers at all. But it's something that I think was really worthy of exploration in a sermon. I mean, we're just an ordinary little congregation with people struggling to find how to make the gospel relevant to them, and to feel that somehow we're held, if you like, in God's care, in the hand of God, somehow as individuals, despite all the terrible things that go on in the world to others, and despite sometimes the tragedies that occur in our own lives. We still have a basic understanding that just doesn't live life by the numbers, doesn't live life by what we own. Is that?
I'd be very happy with that summary, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us in this live on air. And as I said to folk before, we hope to bring maybe one a month of sermon topics to live streaming, simultaneous broadcasts, if you like. But you can always join Kiwi Connection Facebook pages. You can find the Practical Theology channel on YouTube. Or you could actually join the whole Kiwi Connection website, where we discuss all of these and a lot more theological topics. Some of them are in-depth, some of them are very brief, but if it's of use to you, we produce resources that can help you in the Christian journey. So, once again, David, thank you very much indeed, and we'll bring our broadcast to a close.
Thank you.